Welcome to this week's edition of Readings in Theological German. I do have to give my heartfelt apologies for missing a couple of weeks there, but you know, life tends to get in the way sometimes. However, we are back. We're still translating a full article. That's the goal here, and we're going to do a whole nother paragraph today. The article that we have been working on is this article here. This deals with the interpretation of Exodus 19:6 and the whole priestly kingdom or kingdom of priests, or what is going on with that translation. And we're on the last paragraph of a section today. Okay, so here we have the interpretational difficulty in Exodus 19:6a, a nice noun phrase to start the sentence, which means it is going to be your subject, because it's not any kind of an adverbial clause or something like that, or a phrase, and so it's got to be your subject. You do have a compound word here. The difficulty of interpretation is how you might want to render that woodenly with your little genitive modifier inside here. However, I would like to say the interpretational difficulty because it just sounds more fluid in English and basically means the same thing. So the interpretational difficulty of Exodus 19a, now you have your verb here in so-called second position. I like to say conjugated position because that's where you will always find your conjugated verb. So there's usually more than one verb in a sentence, and the one that is conjugated goes in a certain spot. Other than conjugated verbs, you may have things like auxiliary verbs and complementary verbs and things like that, but the conjugated verb is going to go there. And this verb is, well, it's hanging, but you might be looking at this little preposition over here and you think, maybe this is on hanging. Well, it's not. And the reason why you know that it's not is because if it was on hanging, if it was a separable verb, then your on over here would actually have to go and move all the way down and go here to the end of the clause over here. And since it doesn't do that, then you know it's actually functioning as a preposition, and it picks up the next noun phrase there as its complement. And yeah, so that's kind of how you work that out. It probably wouldn't make a huge difference in your translation, but it is important to notice the syntax. So this is hanging on. Okay, let's get this all back together here. I'm going to try to actually just translate the whole sentence real quick, and then we'll go back and talk about a couple of things. So the interpretational difficulties in Exodus 19:6a hangs not only on the uniqueness of the expression, or sorry, the compoundממלכת כהנים, that's kingdom of priests there in Hebrew, but is aggravated further through the fact that construct compounds in Hebrew are very flexible in their semantic structure. So a few different things here. First of all, hanging could be translated as depends. I don't know if you'll find that in your dictionary necessarily, but you can see from the context that's what it means. But in English, we use the English word hang in precisely the same way. I think in English translations of the Bible, you'll find Jesus claiming that the law and the prophets hang on the two great commandments that he talks about. So yeah, so we can just leave it as hang, but it does, of course, mean depend. You could translate it that way as well. Down here you have wird. This is, of course, werden, which is usually an auxiliary verb in German. Not always, but usually. And it certainly is in this case. And you have a participle down here, which means it's passive, which is how I translated it. If you had an infinitive complement, you would have to translate that as a future tense. And then you have, of course, this da compound, which I said through the fact that. So I get through from durch here. And this da, you have to do something with it. It's really picking up this whole next phrase, this das clause. And it's kind of a stand-in for that. And so it's through that, which, the something. And you're sort of wanting to fill that in. And so it's just easier in English to say through the fact that. And finally, you'll notice here that you had a verb down at the end of this das clause, which is, of course, your conjugated verb now because this is a subordinate clause. And so in subordinate clauses, the conjugated verb goes to the end. And I think the rest of that syntax was pretty easy to follow the way that I translated it, but it's definitely in a slightly different order from the way that it is in English. But anyway, not too difficult. For the questioned, you could say maybe, questioned expression in Exodus 19:6, you might want to just say for the expression in question, although technically fraglichen could be something like questionable, which would certainly fit the context here too, because it's being debated, right? What is the right way to handle the semantics of this expression? And so you could even say the debated or debatable expression, something like that, or you could just say the expression in question, which actually is what the English phrase in question often means, but it kind of has more of a referential value, I think, in that case, but nevertheless. Then you have sich lassen, which of course means can be. Always remember you're going to translate that as can be. So the expression in question, for the expression in question alone, there can be 5 grammatical interpretations distinguished. So the reason why you have this unterscheiden down here as an infinitive is because it's actually working with sich lassen, which is kind of a auxiliary in this case, and so you're going to say it can be distinguished here, these 5 grammatical interpretations. Now, you also want to notice here that the next thing is going to be a subordinate clause. It's a relative clause with a relative pronoun here, which, let's see, with a relative clause, you got to find your verb at the end of the clause, and so this is a little bit tricky because you've got this oder here, which now kind of splits it up. So really the end of your clause initially is here. And you have werden, which is down there in the end of the clause, and that tells you, again, because that's in conjugated position, because you're in a subordinate clause, now you have to decide what werden is doing, and it's working together with this verb to make a passive construction once again. So, which is also represented, that's what vertreten means, in the research, or at least has been represented, and so that's where you have that conjunction. Oder gives you kind of a second subordinate clause that's still part of that same subordinate clause, and so it's just like a second ending to that clause, and so again you have down at the end this würden, this time in a past tense, and so then that's why you get this kind of expression. It seems a bit superfluous to say which is represented in research, or at least has been represented in research, or was represented in research. But some authors, I suppose, are a bit verbose, and what can you do? Then you have here und, okay, and now you're going to get a little confused maybe because you have a sich here, and you're going, what is this sich doing? There's nothing else around anywhere nearby. Well, remember, you're in a subordinate clause, so you go down to the end and you find lassen is your verb. This is in conjugated position, just as it was up here, sich lassen. And so because it's in conjugated position, it's at the end because it's in a subordinate clause. However, the sich does not go with it because, of course, it's a reflexive verb, but the sich in reflexive verbs usually occupies a place such as the subject in terms of the word order. And so just as you had your subject here, which was a relative pronoun at the beginning of this subordinate clause, in this now secondary subordinate clause conjoined here with und, you have the subject once again at the beginning of it with the verb at the end, and so you just don't think of it as the subject though because it's really just a reflexive verb, but syntactically that's how it gets laid out in the sentence. And so you could even resupply the relative pronoun here if you wanted to, but of course it's going to be can be again. So you're going to say and, which can be in part, this here stands for zum Teil, in part, as far as, or usually this means until, but you're going to say as far as in the ancient translations therein, or something like that. So can be traced back, zurückverfolgen. This is kind of a separable verb, but it's infinitive, so it's all together here, and it's at the end of the clause. It's just that this has to come even further at the end because zurückverfolgen is actually a complement, and so it comes right before the conjugated verb, which is at the end because you're in a subordinate clause. And so hopefully I'm not overcomplicating this with the way that I'm explaining it, but maybe let's just translate that whole sentence again real quick without all the red and stuff on there so you can see what it really says. Okay, I'm going to really switch this word order around because it's going to flow way better in English. So what you're actually going to say is 5 grammatical interpretations can be distinguished for the debatable expression in Exodus 19:6 alone. So do you see what I did there? I know I promised no red, but actually this is your subject, okay? Because this whole thing up here is a modifying clause. So just keep that in mind, okay? So 5 grammatical interpretations can be distinguished for the debatable expression in 19:6 alone, which also, let's see here, is represented in the research or scholarship, or at least was or has been represented, and which can be in part, traced back. Now you just have a lot of superfluous things here, because you're really just going to say traced back to the ancient translations. And so what was confusing about it is that you have bis and in and hinein that are all kind of in there, and in the end you're just not going to translate all of them in English. But you could say with bis, you could say traced back as far as bis into hinein, and this is a bit superfluous in the ancient translations, but you get the point of what it's trying to say. Sorry, there's red there. What can I say? I lied. As always, thank you for watching. Please do like, subscribe, especially turn on notifications, because you just never know when these videos are going to come out. Share with all your friends. You know, I have 200 subscribers, but I only ever get about 15 to 20 views. I don't know why that is. I think they're not seeing it. So if for some reason you're on here and you don't normally see these, hit that bell, turn on the notifications. That way you'll see when these things come out. See you next week.